Welcome back and happy Monday, April 12th, 2021. There's an item in the news that Patrisse Cullors, one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, recently bought a $1.3 million home in California, but also four other properties. Her properties seem to be worth north of $5 million. Now, recall, she and BLM co-founder Alicia Garza have declared themselves to be trained Marxists. Cullors is famous for saying, quote, "The brutal history of colonialism is one in which white people literally stole land and people for their own gain and material wealth," close quote. Well, I can tell you that ain't true of my family, and if you wanted to fight colonialism, you would have been supportive of the revolution here in 1776. That was a revolution against colonialism. But no, Cullors is talking about a different kind of colonialism, the kind Nikita Khrushchev introduced into the United Nations in order to fight the West, i.e., labeling any enemy of Marxism a colonial power, to A, marginalize the power being fought, and B, to instigate and empower the terrorists in those countries with attractive and felicitous names and concepts to rewrite, well, what they really were. Terrorists. In any event, Patrisse Cullors can't be faulted for stealing land. She's bought an awful lot, presumably not for her own gain and material wealth, which she condemns, right? Reminds me of the story of Leonid Brezhnev showing one of his famous ornate dachas to his mom, and she responded, "So this is what is meant by the dictatorship of the proletariat." This movement built to fight repression has done quite well. In a country where it says black lives don't matter and that we all have to recite that they do, you have the head of that movement buying a house for over $1 million, and you have that movement itself raising over $90 million last year, a year where most nonprofits as well as for-profits were struggling like hell. They sure know how to market, and they did, taking in some $90 million in a down economic year. A major profile of one of the founders of BLM, Patrisse Cullors' colleague, Alicia Garza, was done on CBS Sunday Morning a few months back. And why not? She had a new book out. To those of us that have researched the BLM movement and organization a bit, we knew the name Alicia Garza. She, along with Cullors, is the other self-declared trained Marxist. To point that out is to be considered missing the point or to engage in some kind of slander of a good and decent movement or people. I continually point out it's not slander if it's true, and it's not criticism if you call someone what that person calls themselves and boasts about. Of course, none of it, was raised by the person on CBS, Mark Whitaker, who interviewed her. What you got instead was a puff piece, a promotional piece, a major show segment promoting Miss Garza and her movement. She's doing nothing more than, quote, "founding groups aimed at empowering women and building black political power," close quote. That was the most interesting thing to me. Not a single question on her actual and radical beliefs. Just about how she got started, and not ideologically, but physically, with the use of social media and a personal story. And that personal story was the second most interesting thing to me. Let me quote directly from the CBS transcript. Quote, "So that was your first big cause as an activist?" asked Whitaker. Garza says, "I was 12 years old. I was in middle school." In her book, Garza recounts a formative moment at age 17, a run-in with a police officer who found her smoking marijuana with a friend and let her off with only a warning. She said, "I was a kid who was doing things the kids do, and I was given a shot, but most black kids who were my age at that time are not given a shot, and guaranteed if I had been a 17-year-old black girl in West Oakland caught with the same amount of marijuana, I would have spent not just the night, but a lot longer in jail. I would have had a criminal record," close quote. So I'm not following. 12 years old or 17 years old? Perhaps the facts don't matter. But what is most interesting to me is her grievance, her complaint. Her start is all based on something that did not happen and something that was hypothetical. She was a young black woman caught breaking the law, what she says doing things the kids do. I suppose like when Nancy Pelosi says people will do what people would do when asked about Antifa destroying statues in Baltimore. Garza, she was caught breaking the law back when anti-marijuana enforcement was much stricter than today, and she was released with no incident at all. But she invents in her mind how that would not be the case with someone else. Invents, speculates, hypothesizes. And just as we know the major themes of institutional racism, especially in our police departments, are based on non-fact, so too the formative moment, as Garza puts it, in her catalyzing of activism. Something that didn't happen. No incident. One she dreamed up might happen to someone else. Not a single question about being a trained Marxist, not a single follow-up to what she said in the interview. After all, to underscore it would be to underscore the antithesis of her formative moment and movement, not its thesis. But there's that nagging Marxist dialectic again, isn't there? Complete with a synthesis built around a hypothesis that in actuality contradicts the thesis. Or as Vladimir Lenin put it, the struggle of mutually exclusive absolutes. George Orwell makes it easier to hold simultaneously two opinions which cancel out, knowing them to be contradictory and believing in both of them, to use logic against logic, to repudiate morality while laying claim to it. As for Kahlura's, she declares herself a police abolitionist, so I take it none of her homes have security systems. But can we talk about a police abolition movement and the BLM for just a moment? What is the greatest danger to black lives in America, at least the greatest preventable danger to black lives in America today? Larry Elder writes, the number one cause of preventable death for young white men is accidents, such as car accidents and drownings. The number one reason for death, preventable or otherwise, for young black men is homicide, almost always at the hands of another young black man. In the most recent year for which we have data, there were approximately 7,400 black homicide victims, more than half of the nation's total number of homicides, while the black population is only 13% of the U.S. total. Jason Johns, former deputy commissioner of the Baltimore Police, has an op-ed in the Arizona Republic today, and he writes that last year, the United States tallied more than 20,000 murders, the highest total since 1995, and 4,000 more than the year prior, 2019. Preliminary FBI data for 2020 points to a 25% surge in murders, the largest single-year increase since the agency began publishing uniform data in 1960. Policing is to blame, or rather, the lack of it. In the wake of the May and June unrest last year, public officials' decisions and growing hostility towards policing left law enforcement demoralized, debilitated, and in some cases defunded. Even the most dedicated officers, who now face a greater risk of being sued, fired, or prosecuted for doing their job, feel pressure to pull back. The message from a new wave of progressive prosecutors is clear. Making arrests for drug and weapons crimes that will go unprosecuted exposes officers to the risk of disciplinary action, lawsuits, and criminal prosecution. To mitigate that risk, police take a more passive approach. Data shows a precipitous decline in law enforcement activity from last June through this February. We found that across the 10 major cities we studied, deadly violence rose as engaged policing fell. Cities that cut or threatened to cut police budgets often saw the largest drops in active policing and largest increases in homicides. After the George Floyd protests started in New York City, the New York Police Department logged 45,000 fewer arrests from June to December, a 38% decline, while New York added more than 100 additional homicides, a 58% increase. From June through the end of this February, Chicago's police made 31,000 fewer arrests, a 53% decline, as murders rose 65%. In Louisville, where massive unrest included the shooting of 2 police officers during a protest, homicides jumped 87% as the police made 35% fewer vehicle stops, and arrests plummeted 42% during the summer months year over year. From Los Angeles and Houston to New Orleans and Minneapolis, the political response to the unrest led to depolicing and the resulting record violence. Already bloody, St. Louis hit a 50-year homicide high, a rate of 87 per 100,000 residents, a rate 3 times higher than Mexico and Central America. As Milwaukee announced slashing 120 officers from its police force, the city saw a 98% increase in killings. Philadelphia hit a 30-year high with 500 homicide victims in 2020 and more than 100 in 2021 so far. As Progressive District Attorney Larry Krasner has dropped 50% of both drug and illegal gun cases, police have reduced vehicle and pedestrian stops by 72%. In 2020, overall arrests fell by a third. Police Commissioner Danielle Outlaw grudgingly admitted that public officials' attacks demoralized the police, encouraging depolicing. Over the summer, Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler defunded the Portland Police Bureau by $12 million and eliminated 3 police units, and then chaos engulfed the city, with shootings going up 173% and murders jumping an astounding 255%. Yet today, the conversation is about infrastructure, institutional racism, and racism as a pandemic. Let's start a serious discussion on infrastructure, of which the most important is our people, their safety, and their lives. And let's not listen to the hucksters anymore. I'm Seth Leibson. We'll be right back.